All right. Sorry to disturb the deepest of conversations. Welcome back. So hopefully for today you will have read and thought about part of the first real substantive chapter in the book by Altman and Wellman. So it's the chapter on self-determination and democracy, chapter 2. The remainder of the first introductory chapter that we didn't read is just them giving an overview of the variety of chapters that are coming. That's informative if you want to read it, but we're not going to spend time discussing that in class. This chapter, we'll chop it up. As you've seen, we'll start it with the beginning and the end, and then the bit in between we'll get to later. Altman and Wellman have some controversial things to say about democracy and the value of democracy and how it relates to self-determination. But the way their argument goes is they first give you an account of what they think self-determination is and what its value is and how it fits within their theory and sort of liberal thinking more in general. And then they go on to democracy. So I want to first try and wrap our heads around this idea of self-determination because it comes and goes pretty quickly in what Altman and Wellman write. And that's a sort of a feature of people who write about self-determination or sovereignty. When people invoke these ideas, they usually talk about them as if they're perfectly clear and obvious and then move on to what they think they mean and what the implications are, but they really aren't. A lot of the disagreements turn out to be disagreements about the idea itself. So I want to take it easy, take it slowly anyway, not easy, it's hard, but take it slowly, and so the first few sessions will be actually trying to figure out what's going on when we talk about things like self-determination. In 2016, not 2015. This is the 25th. All right. So I asked you to... Are you seeing this any clearer? I'm trying to replace blue and white with white and black. No? Still terrible? How about if last time we had half the lights on. How about... Better? Like better as in I can read this? Or yeah? Okay, good. That way at least we can hopefully stay awake and read at the same time. That's kind of ideal. All right, so I put a couple of reading questions up on Tuesday. Not going to have a pub quiz, but they're the kind of reading questions that you should expect, and that will be the basis of a pub quiz. So we'll go over, I won't go over them one by one in the slides that I have, but after we've done these slides, you should have a very clear idea about what the answers to these things should be. But before we get that, I want to just ask you guys, you got a little first taste of what Altman and Wellman are up to, how they write, how they argue, and what style of philosophy this is. Do you have a sense you're getting somewhere? Do you ever feel that you're getting this? Or the things that you're reading and you thought, I can't really understand or can't get my head around? Any questions or things? Yeah. Shay? Sorry? No. Not Alexis?
Yeah.
Remember that too.
What I thought self-determination was, I guess it was, doing things for yourself, like you being self-sovereign, and
You mean you as a person?
Yeah, you as a person, and then value individualism was when, meaning that individuals are like the ultimate source of all that matters morally.
Right.
And then it was saying how's the tension between these two, and that was when I got to that part of the book, I kept circling back because I couldn't really understand what the tension was, and then I had to look it up, and it was saying how self-determination is more not only in individuals by themselves, but I guess in a group. And then, it's interdependent, while value individualism deals with everything you do is focused mainly on you in society.
Right. Good.
I'm not really sure what I'm trying to say. I didn't fully understand.
Right. Yeah, but those are definitely the main things that are going on. There's the thing the thing that Altman and Wellman are trying to pull off here is they try to give a theory that is based and organized around the idea of self-determination, But self-determination not just for the individual, although we hear and we read a lot about that, and usually people who grow up in societies like us, we take that to be an important value, that individual self-determination, your individual freedom, the idea that you get to decide how you live and other people can't afford, these type of ideas. But they're trying to use that not just as individual self-determination, although they do believe in that, but they also believe in that as a collective or group based. Right. So as groups or societies, nations maybe, countries, right, that are all these things that are collectives of one form or another, can then also enjoy this type of self-determination that we, in other contexts, attribute to individuals. Right? And so that, since it's a theory, start at the beginning, right? So it's a liberal theory of international justice, right? So we're going to talk about international political things, right? So the main actors, the main agents that make up the international scene are countries, right? States, if you want to use the term of art. So countries governed by governments, it's a lot of people living together in some type of institutional form under a government, under rules of laws and so on, right? So collective entities. Those things are going to have rights of self-determination for Altman and Wellman, for most people. It's a cornerstone of international law that they do. Right? So rights of sovereignty, the idea that one country can't invade another and just subject its people. Why not? Self-determination is the answer, right? People think that groups can separate, secede from other countries, like the Basques are trying in Spain for decades now, like Quebecois for a long time tried in Canada, like the Scots almost did in the UK 2 years ago now. 2 years ago? I think it was 2 years ago. Anyway, why? Self-determination, right? Why was decolonization a good idea after the Second World War? Why? Self-determination. That stuff comes up over and over again. And so they're trying to give us a theory that makes sense of this. Now, the trick is, the trick for them is going to be, and we'll get back to this, but it's a liberal theory, right? And the liberal for them means something. And that's what that value individualism tenet or claim or principle is supposed to trace or make explicit. And it has to do with the thing that ultimately matters is individual people. They think is the hallmark of a liberal theory. And then the trick becomes, okay, well, if we're going to talk about what's so important about these collectives, these states, nations, groups, societies being independent or sovereign or democratic or what have you, that's collectivist stuff, and then we have liberal stuff, and then how do these two fit together, right? So that's the stuff that these few pages that we're looking at, they try to give you some type of an account of that. All right. So, the value individualism thing that I asked you in the reading questions, I'm just going to notice, for once, we won't do this whole term, but for today, just a note where you can find these type of answers, right? The value individualism, they actually define that, right? There's a definition, say, value individualism, we take, like you said, where it's the only things that, like individuals are the only things that have moral value, or value from a moral point of view, something like that. I'll have the quote later on. And then the other thing is they talk about self-determination being irreducibly collective. What do you think that means? Say what? Yeah.
It means, well, from what I got, it means that an inherent value of democracy cannot be broken down to represent each individual personal rights, but it must be based on the collective moral rights of a group of individuals as a whole.
Right. Good. Yeah. I have one slight footnote or asterisk to that. It's perfect, except it's not just about democracy, right? In this chapter, it's about democracy, but self-determination for Altman and Wellman is broader than just democracy. So democracy might be one thing that's based on self-determination, although most people believe that. They actually don't believe that. That's what the rest of the chapter does that you didn't read. So it doesn't matter. But all the other stuff that we're going to discuss, they're going to relate or base on or link to self-determination as well. So that's going to be the foundational idea, and then the other ideas sort of put on top of that. So, yeah, okay. Well, so you put it very nicely, right? You said self-determination is about the collective. Right? There's something that is. Right. Yeah. So you can't if it's irreducible, right? Then you can't reduce it, right? So, obviously. What would it be to reduce it? If self-determination could be reduced to individual?
Individual. It would be, like what they're saying, I think, in the reading was that the individual doesn't have a right to form its own government. You know what I mean? That is only a collective group, a state or a group that is a potential state has that right.
Good, exactly, yes. So yeah, so self-determination is something, I think I put later on a slide, it's something you have to do together, right? Like it's not, you can't do that by yourself. Right? And so then the tension comes, right? So if there is some value to this happening, but it's something people cannot do by themselves, right? And you're also saying the only things that matter are things that are individuals, which is people by themselves, right? Now we have a question about how do these two things fit together into one view that makes sense. Right? Because the value individualism seems to deny the value of anything that would be collective. Because individualism says the collectives don't matter, it's the individuals that matter, right? And vice versa, the collective says, well, more than just individuals matter. And so that's the thing, that's kind of the square they're trying to circle, or I don't know how to, square this, yeah, that's it. Sorry, one sec. What's your name? Reggie? Okay.
Jeff.
Jeff, and you're Anthony, is that right? Jay, Jeff, Reggie, Jeff, Anthony. Yeah, go on.
How many people does it take to make a state?
Well, it's a good question. You mean, I don't know, like in real life? I don't know. Like, the small, they get quite small, right? Like Luxembourg is, I think, a couple 100,000. So it gets smaller than that. The Vatican is a state, so that's probably a couple of hundred, maybe. I don't know. I mean, the definition of a state in international law is like it takes a couple of things. It's very little that you need. You need territory, a stable population, and some type of government. That's roughly just one more. Can't think of it off the top of my head, but that's basically like so. You need a place, some people, and and you need some other people bossing those people around. That's more or less the definition under international law that you need. So how many? I don't know. Like 3 could they do? I don't know. For Altman and Wellman, it's going to be more than 1, 2, 3. For them, they think for a legitimate state. So this is not just descriptively, right? Like what would international law actually require as a state, but this is prescriptively or ethically, like what should an international law that's actually ethically defensible, what should that kind of international law do? And they think, well, the smallest state is going to be the state that is capable of protecting human rights. And they think that takes more than just one person, because if you think it can be done by everybody by themselves, then you're an anarchist. Right? If you think we don't need law or governments and so on, everyone can just do it by themselves. They think, well, we're not anarchists, that would lead to chaos, so we need to have people actually grouping together in some type of society with laws. And so, well, how many people do we need for that to be stable and actually working? Well, don't know. But whatever that number is, that's going to be it. So the moral theory gives you a method for figuring out how that would work. So, I don't know, the Vatican is an exceptional case, right? But maybe a few hundred would be enough. That's the best I can do. Yeah. Well, you can try. Good luck. Yeah. All right, I'm going to start going through these. Oh, anyone else? Sorry. Any questions or things lingering that you thought you wanted to discuss before I get going? All right, you can call. You can change your mind. Let me know. All right. So this is how we're going to go about this, right? Remember what we're just doing this term and what especially Altman and Wellman are doing in this book, right? Like, what's the proper role of self-determination and sovereignty in international affairs? That's the question. And I'll post these on Canvas again, so you don't have to pen everything down if you don't. If you want to, go ahead. But all right, and then they have a particular take on this, right? That's the general question. Now here is the particular version that Altman and Wellman are giving. You give an answer. So here's our answer. Give you a liberal theory about this that actually makes sense of a lot of it. So what we need to know then is we need to know what makes a theory liberal. We've talked a little bit about that. We need to talk about what their view of self-determination is. Talked a little bit about that already, and then see maybe if we can find some alternatives. If we have some contrast, we can think about what are the moves that Altman and Wellman are making, the ideas that they have that are not obvious or not the only ones available. All right. So, what makes a theory liberal? So, it's a liberal theory, right? That matters to them. They put it in their title. You don't put it in your title if you don't think it matters. So, when philosophers, this might be obvious, sorry if it is, but when philosophers talk about liberal or liberalism, they use the term in a slightly different way than people talk about it these days in like election cycles, right? So now when we say liberal, we mean usually someone who supports the Democratic Party or something, right? That's not exactly what philosophers mean by liberal. We usually have in mind something more of like a longer, richer intellectual tradition that goes back at least to John Locke, maybe earlier. And it's a theory that makes, well, for Altman and Wellman, that puts at center stage the individual. So, liberal, the word, of course, reminds you, like, the root has to do with liberty and so on, right? So the idea is, the liberal tradition arises out of a contrast or a rejection of sort of feudal thinking of the Middle Ages. Right? If I asked you, what is feudalism? Can anyone give like a very rough working idea about what feudalism was or was about? Shay?
Is that like a split up of the system of is that a social system? You got like maybe knights and stuff.
Right, yeah. Yeah, so like it's a very rough rule of thumb. You can think it's like it's a Game of Thrones world, you know. So you have like the class of the ruling elites. They're born into the right families. They don't really have to work, right? They fight wars among each other. That's sort of mostly how they pass time, vying for power and so on. And then there's sort of the common people, and then there's the clergy, right? So these are in feudal times used to be the three sort of classes. So the religious class, and they're kind of neatly separated from each other in life. And there's a strict hierarchy, like a hierarchy in terms of worth and value, right? The word dignitaries still reminds of that time, right? Like, so the dignitaries are the ones who are people who have office, right? Like, they're dignitaries because they have a kind of dignity that us, the common people, don't have. And so under feudalism, if you're born into the royal family or you're a lord or whatever, right, then you have rights, very clearly, you have rights and freedoms and entitlements that other people, normal people, commoners, right, don't have. So traditionally speaking, in most of the feudal systems, the king would be, strictly speaking, the owner of all the land. So the realm belongs to the king, literally, like the owner. And then sort of, at that point, would give sort of leaseholds to his lords, who would then, in return, supply him with troops, right? So he could fight his wars. And then those lords would sort of divvy it out to sort of local leaders that would then pay allegiance to him and would pay taxes. And then those lords would be the commoners, and they would just basically take parts of their crops and whatever other jobs they might do, right? So they'd have to pay taxes and so on. So it's sort of, like the whole system sort of works up towards the top, right? And it's extractive, right? So the people on the top don't really give much back to the ones on the bottom, and the ones on the bottom are really beholden to the ones at the top. And so you don't get to, guilds work like this. You don't get to just choose whatever profession you have. You want to become a basket weaver, you have to go through the ones who are in charge of basket weaving in society. They're the ones who get to choose whether you become a basket weaver or not, and you have to, if they allow you, then yes, and if they don't allow you, then you find some other work, right? That's it. Sorry?
So you can't go up in the system.
Right, and you can't, well, unless the people on top choose to elevate you, right, yeah, but you can't work your way up or anything. That isn't. So, you're born, you're born poor, you're going to probably die poor, right? And you're born in the right family, you're going to die wealthy, right? And so the idea here is that that's a system in which there is a clear social ranking, based on birth. And the liberal theory tries to rejects that, right? It's an idea that comes with, actually, you find this in Locke very clearly, for example, if you read John Locke. If you haven't read John Locke, come next term, take social and political philosophy with me. You will read John Locke, it's great. But Locke comes out and just says, this, more or less, at the outset says, naturally, as we are born, as he puts it in the eyes of God, but just as we are born, there are no natural bosses, right? Like everyone is equal. Hobbes says the same thing. This is the big liberal turnaround. We're equal in the sense that everyone has equal rights and equal freedoms. No one is born into authority or standing or rights that others don't have. And so whether you're a man or a woman, doesn't matter, equal rights, right? Whether you're black or white doesn't matter, equal rights, right? Whether you're a Kennedy or a Jones, whoever, it doesn't matter, right? Equal rights. Or Clinton, as the I guess is the reference these days, right? Doesn't matter, equal rights. You should have as good a chance as the others to be the one who's in power or the one who's not. And so, all right, that's the core idea around which various liberal theories are organized. Of course, there's a lot of debate, a lot of bickering, a lot of fighting about how exactly we make sense of that, right? Like how equal must equal be, in what sense is equal, when are we not equal, and so that's hundreds of years of theory now. But all those theories, it's a family quarrel, right? Because they all start with this idea that this rejection of natural differences between people. And so the idea of human rights, for example, is a very liberal idea, right? It's every human being, by virtue of being a human being, has the same set of basic rights. That's a rejection of natural authority. You can't have that in Game of Thrones, right? That doesn't exist. All right. So far, so good? Yeah, Shay?
So I didn't really, as you were going through the examples, I didn't really understand what made it theory difficult.
Yeah, so at its most fundamental, most abstract, it's this rejection of natural moral differences between people. So at its most abstracted, that's the negative way to put it, positively to say it's an affirmation of moral equality among all human beings. So the same basic rights and freedoms apply to everybody. Right? And so, for example, one thing that you see that you get in people like Hobbes and Locke, right, is like, well, if that's true, if we're all naturally equal and there are no natural appointed kings, how come that some people boss other people around, right? So looks like Clinton is going to be the boss for the next 4 years in this country, right? So she's going to boss us around, more or less, right? How come? What gives her the right if we're naturally equal? Right? Why don't I get her to boss her around? Or here's an idea: why nobody gets to boss anybody around? Right? Well, then we have elections and stuff, right? If we appoint as a people appointed, that's the basic answer that people give. All right, well that's an answer, but you need an answer. Right? And the hallmark of a liberal theory is that you need an answer. The feudalist doesn't need an answer. It says, well, because they're born better than you, right? They have blue blood or something. Right? That's it. Right? I don't need to explain why she's the boss. That's it. Right? She's born in the right family. Shut up. Right? The liberal says, no, that's not good. No, there is no right family. There's no wrong. All individuals are equally valuable. And so. All right. Where am I? Okay, so here's how Altman and Wellman try and make sense of that very abstract, broad brushstroke idea. So the individual and her rights, his rights, are put at center stage, right? That's just more or less what I was just talking about. And then the claim of value individualism comes, right? And so they say individuals are the ultimate source of all that matters morally. Question, do you agree with this? Does anyone not agree with this? All right, so individuals are the ultimate source of all that matters morally. So basically it means that if something has value, morally speaking, like from an ethical point of view, right? If something ethically or morally you should care about. Anything, right? All that matters. So for all things that you can think are morally important. They are morally important because in some way how they relate to individual people. Can anyone think of a counterexample? Like, is anything that bothers you about Anthony?
I don't think that's all true, because like back in I think World War II, when we had to go through reparations, and we had to kind of like stick together as like a colony. And sometimes we had to turn into like an ant colony and kind of work together for the greater good rather than just the individual at the time. Because then people a lot of times individually will take advantage of as much as they can, and that can end up hurting everyone.
Good. So what might Altman and Wellman say about that? Can anyone think how they might defend themselves against that type of worry?
Even in those cases, usually the goal is ultimately to get back to defending individual rights and securing individual rights. Anytime that we temporarily put our individual rights on hold for some greater good, it still ultimately boils down to we had to stop this from happening to individuals. We have to ensure that individuals aren't subjected to this, that, or the other.
Good, exactly. So I think that, I forgot your name. So.
Jason.
Jason. Yeah, so that's the kind of, well, you might not like that answer, right? But that's the kind of answer they would have to give, right? They say, well, yeah, when you fight, like you try to liberate Europe from the Nazi rule or something, right? Then you say, well, lots of people are going to die. What about those people? Well, the type of answer they'll have to give is that that's somehow justifiable because of the individuals we're trying to rescue. It cannot be right, something like, well, it's for the greater glory of the American people, right, or the American nation, or the flag, or what have you not, right, or the historical march of of civilizations dictates that it's now America's turn to come up in something like that, right, which is a story that doesn't appeal to what these individual people are going through. That would be excluded by this. Yeah. That's an interesting question. Not necessarily, although there's ways you can spin this that would make it that way. I mean, not necessarily as the reason, as stated like this, no. Right? So if you take utilitarianism, think back all the way to the classic statement by Bentham, right? Bentham, I used to be able to do this verbatim, but not quite anymore. It was like every person matters for one and no one more than one. So, right? That's the idea for utilitarianism. You count. The right thing to do is to maximize the happiness of all the people. That's the basic moral rule of utilitarianism. And so how do you calculate how to maximize happiness? Well, Bentham said you count every individual person's happiness for one and no one more than one. Right? So that's, it says, look, that's ultimately what matters. It's the happiness of you, me, right? Like, and everyone exactly. So that works, right? Of course, some people think that utilitarianism ultimately slips into something like where the pile of happiness that has to be maximized, that becomes the thing we care about ultimately, and individual people get to be sacrificed. If you think that's true, a good description of utilitarianism, that would violate this. Bentham doesn't think so, but maybe he was wrong. But so, and what's your name? Mike. All right. I mean, I'm harping on this a little because this is a really strong thing to say. Right? Just you might not stumble on this the first time you read it, but sort of as a philosopher, this sets off alarm bells in my head. Right? Look at like individuals are the ultimate source of all that. Whenever you get these sort of universal quantifiers, or all that matters morally, that's okay, everything. I think the reason why there's a reason why they're going so strongly. I'll get back to that in a second. But can you think of anything that you might think is morally important, but that doesn't have to do with individual people?
Okay, that's what I meant. I was confused as to whether this is saying that moral matters are only decidedly so because individuals decide them to be the case, or whether that was meaning that moral facts only pertain to individuals, which would, for example, preclude animal rights and things like that.
Right. Well, that's a good question, right? Like, so if animals are not included in the set of individuals here, right? And let's assume that it's human beings only for now. Yeah, then the animals could have rights, but the only reason why they could have rights is because animals having rights is better for human beings. Right? So just like earlier, right? We said, well, maybe we have to have a war in which some people suffer, but that's justifiable because that's really important for those other people. Right? So we have to ultimately get back to those other people. So this looks like animal rights might be in danger. Yeah, it's a good question. Ryan, right? Is that right?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, Reggie?
So would that mean that as far as the environment, you want to say that only the source is individual? The environment will matter morally as far as if you want to survive, you want to keep individualism going.
Exactly, yeah. Right, so, yeah, that's questionable at least, right? So if you think, some people think that the environment itself has value, right? And it seems that Altman and Wellman are committing themselves to saying something like, well, it has value insofar as it serves us as people, right? So, like global warming might be a bad thing because it's dangerous for us, right? But not bad for so, cutting down the rainforest is bad because we might run out of oxygen, but if we, if we can cut half without, then cut half, right? Or maybe it's only, well, maybe we lose some sort of aesthetic pleasure, right? It's really beautiful to see these big. Okay, well, and that's the reason, but it's nothing good about being the forest being the. Right.
Or they want to drill offshore, close to the coastline.
Right.
Some
Just.
oil spills, everything else. Still affect individuals because now water is contaminated.
Right, but that's the question we have to answer to them, right? Always it comes down to something like that. Like, is it good or bad for people? So some species goes extinct. Is it bad? Well, it depends. Is anyone affected by it? Like, no? Well, then it's hard to explain if there was something. Right, so.
Well, wouldn't that mean that value individualism isn't a liberal theory? Because it's stating that one species is better than another, or we are automatically on top of everything else around us. Everything else is only here because of us.
Well, the liberal theory, like, what's your name? Sorry. Sydney? Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, the liberal theory, as any theory really that's going to be plausible, would have to draw a line somewhere, a cutoff line between the things that all have this equal value that the liberal insists on, right? And then other things that don't. Like, I probably think it's, like, no good theory could say that rocks are as important as people, right? So, any theory, liberal or not, will have to say, like, rocks, okay, you guys don't matter. Right? Like, you can split a rock, and you can throw a rock, and you can blow up a rock, like all these things, right? Okay, that's not morally wrong. At least not unless some other story. Like, just harming the rock, okay, it's just a rock. So, okay, well, then the rock is that, right? Then we can go on. Like, what else, right? So there's maybe trees. Well, some people disagree, but most people think you can cut down trees for using it. So, okay, then trees. And then we have to go all the way out. At some point, there's going to be a cutoff, right? But it does look that what Altman and Wellman are saying is that whatever is an individual, we're assuming human beings, maybe some great apes would count or something, right? Maybe an orangutan is an individual. So maybe we get great ape rights, but cows are probably out. Right? It's a little weird to call cows individuals. Sorry?
In our culture.
Right, well, and at least it seems for them, for the theory that they're developing, it should be out, yeah. Now that might not be the right way to go, but it seems that that's what they're committing themselves to. I forget your name. Sorry? Tamir. There you go.
This theory seems like it's really narcissistic.
In what way? Narcissistic.
All
Is me? That's the idea.
the individual has like the same fate. All that matters. That's what I mean by narcissism.
Yeah, that's interesting. So some ways, and we'll get to it in a moment, like why I think they go for this. This is such a strong view, right? But one way is that some people disagree with liberal theories in general, or this kind of strong value individualism, is for reasons like that. So next time, I believe, we'll be reading Michael Walzer, and he labels himself a communitarian. That's whatever, it's a term that that philosophers use. Communitarians are people who think that actually communities, in some sense, are more important than individuals. It's a little, they probably wouldn't accept that me putting it that way, but the idea is, well, individuals can only really fully be free and be themselves and have a full life in a broader community of beings where we're related to each other and interconnected and so on. And we derive value from that community. And so in some sense, the community comes before the individuals that live within it. So something like that. Right? And that gives value to the community. And that value is more than just the value of the individuals that are in it, because the community comes first, right? So the individuals get value from the community, not the other way around. And so that's is that kind of what you have in mind? That this is like, we shouldn't just look at ourselves, but also the way that we live together as a society or as a group?
Yeah, like ourselves in respect, like everything else in respect for us.
Right. Yeah, so these communitarians, so you're in good company there, right? So communitarians have something like that feeling, where they feel like if you keep stripping away all these ideas of culture and the history that comes with the culture and the community in which you live and all that stuff, then you really you're losing a lot of stuff that really matters ultimately. And by stipulation, they're losing that, right? They by design, if that stuff is gone for them. Jeff, did you have your hand up? No, come to you, Jason.
Kind of to add to what he said, like, so If the individual is all that matters, then where does sacrifice for the greater good come into that? Right?
Well, in some sense, yeah, good. So why does sacrifice for the greater good come in? At some level, it's designed to block that. Right? So people who would agree with Altman and Wellman, who see themselves as this kind of liberal, would say, actually, this talk about sacrifice for the greater good is really dangerous. It usually leads to people minorities being abused at the hands of a majority for the greater good, blah, right? So I'm lampooning a little bit what your view would probably be, right? You probably wouldn't hold that. But, or maybe you, whatever. So, don't want to put words in your mouth. But so that's what they fear, right? And that's why they say, this is why someone like Altman Wellman might say, this is why I insist on such a strong view, because I'm afraid of this type of talk and what it will lead to. So I don't want people to be sacrificed for the greater good, because I don't want people to be sacrificed.
Right, but I'm not talking about like a state or a group of individuals making that choice for another group or whatever, an individual.
Right.
But an individual making that choice for
good.
his state or group. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's a really nice response. That's a really nice response, because it seems that if this is true, that would make no sense, right?
Right.
Like that person would be doing something irrational, because they would be sacrificing themselves for something that doesn't exist.
Right.
Right. Right. So if that really does make sense, right? If we think, no, wait, it does make sense to choose to sacrifice yourself for the greater good. A, and B, you think it doesn't make sense to explain that in just individualistic terms, then you have a real good argument against this idea, right? Because then this theory is denying that something exists that really exists. Right? Yeah, it's a good argument. Yeah. Okay. Jason?
I was just saying, I think it's really easy to read that statement and kind of, in your mind, draw up the word morally, and kind of read it as it's saying only individuals are ultimately what matters. But in saying that they're all that matter, like the ultimate source of all that matters morally, could be that we can only expect an understanding of morality from individuals. We wouldn't hold a volcano morally responsible for sinking an island and killing 30,000 people because it's incapable of morality. Or as far as we know, it's not sentient. It has no concept, no individualism, no capability for morality. I mean, you look out in space and there's continuously self-destructive things happening in star systems and everything like that. There's seemingly no rhyme or reason to it. There seems to be some guiding principles, but overall it's just, almost like chaos and everything. So only when we say, and I'm also including animals though, like the more capable an animal is of sensing their own individualism, then the more capable they seem of acting somewhat morally in different situations.
Right. Yeah, good. And so you might be someone like Altman or Wellman and say, we shouldn't overestimate the importance of the moral part of life. There are many different parts of life. So maybe there is things that matter morally, and then there are things that matter aesthetically, right? Or something, just in terms of beauty. That beauty is not ethics. And so these rainforests are really beautiful. So if they don't matter morally, it doesn't mean they don't matter. They just matter in a different way or something, right? So you might try and sort of patch up your theory a little bit like that. Of course, that's going to raise a whole bunch of new questions, right? So what if we have a conflict between moral and aesthetic value? And now we have to, now which one wins, right? Usually we say do the right thing. So then it would mean you can call it aesthetic value, but anytime there's a conflict, aesthetic value goes away. So you're not patching up much, right? Well, if morality doesn't always win from aesthetics, then now we need a theory about how to balance the two. When one wins, now you're in a whole lot of trouble philosophically, right? But you're right. We shouldn't assume too quickly that to say that things matter morally is the same as saying that things matter, period. All right. Promise you will usually go faster, but this is good. Just one last point about this. Why do Altman and Wellman say this strongly, I think? We're coming up with some pretty forceful objections here, right? Like about aesthetics. We're coming up with objections about people sacrificing themselves, which intuitively seems to be a sensible thing to do, and it seems to be dropping out. Animal rights we came up with. all sorts of worries, right? Now, why would they go in for this hard? The reason, I think they might be purposefully overstating what they really believe. That's obviously always a dangerous thing to say. Maybe they really do believe this. But one possible reason why, as a philosopher, you might say this is this book is trying to revive and defend in these liberal terms, so two liberals, this idea about collective self-determination. With the rise of this liberal way of thinking, self-determination has become more and more suspicious. And Ullmann and Wellman are really one of the first real thorough attempts at reviving that idea and explaining it in these liberal terms. So it's a collectivist idea. It's an idea that most liberals think is scary because it will lead to the kind of sacrifice talk that I was accusing falsely Jeff of before, right? This sort of like, oh, let's just sacrifice the minority for the majority.
I'm talking about colonialism.
Right. So, but people did talk about colonialism that way, right? And they used things like the greater good, the March of Nations, the collective, the whatever, right? All that lingo, and that was collectivist lingo. And so when the liberal tradition really, caught on steam the second half of this 20th century, and human rights and these individual freedom ideas become more and more emphasized, everything that had this collectivist taste to it started getting kicked out, right? Okay, that's all this old dangerous stuff, including self-determination, and that's the thing they want to save. Right? And so how do you save it without getting accused of being one of those old collectivist people? Well, this is one way. Right? You just go in super hard for individualism. And you say, well, you can't accuse me because I don't even believe in the environment having value. Right? So it might be strategic. I'm not sure they want to believe, but that's one reason why philosophically you might want to put something this strongly. Right? It's like, say, look, I can defend, like self-determination has to make sense because I can defend it even on this extremely strong individualist view. Maybe we have to weaken this and allow for animal rights or allow for these type of greater good ideas. Okay, well now we're getting closer to self-determination, right? So if you buy it on these terms, you better buy it on these richer or more plausible terms. So it's like an argument. It's like a strategic move if you're building an argument. So like, make your assumptions as minimal or as uncontroversial as you can, and then see, like, I can still get my conclusion. That's a much stronger argument than if you start with these lost, big, spraying or like all over the place assumptions and premises and so on. All right. Any questions so far? Before I move on? No. So, this is what Ullmann and Wellman say. What I have here. Oh, yeah. So, Ullmann and Wellman don't really defend this. Right? This is an assumption. Last time we talked a little bit about things being right and wrong at all. Right? That's just the assumption we were taking. Ullmann and Wellman do this too, right? They say, okay, I'm going to assume things are right and wrong, but I'm also going to assume that they're right and wrong in this particular liberal way, and they don't really defend it. Right? We were talked about this, but it is an assumption, and yeah, like we've discussed, right? It's an assumption that can be challenged. Seems sensibly anyway. All right, well, so here's the bottom line. If we're going to buy into value individualism, and for the sake of argument now, we're going to go along with it just to understand the theory and get the theory right. You might not believe it, but I'm tempted by something like value individualism, by the way. It's not a crazy view. But anyway. If you're going to buy into value individualism, like they are, then what the task that you're setting yourself up for is self-determination. If that's going to be something you explain or value or defend, you better defend it in terms that go to individual values, right? And in their case, human rights. That's the way they interpret it. So you can now see the task, right, of the book. Self-determination matters, but it has to matter in a way that's consistent with this, which means they have to give you a story about self-determination being important that can be translated into individualist terms. And now, again, you can see the conflict, right, about the third question. Okay, if it's translatable in individualist terms, how can it be irreducibly collective? Right? That's the puzzle. All right. That's what I just said. Where am I? Right. We talked about this, so I'm going to go on. You can get these back on Canvas. All right. So what do we mean by self-determination? That was the liberal part. So this is the second step, right? Like, if there's a liberal theory of self-determination, what's that thing? So Reggie, in the beginning, you said it has to do with democracy. And Shay, you said something about it's like individual self-determination.
Yeah, that's what it was.
Okay. Right, good, right. So yeah, so the word sovereignty is not far away. Controlling your own affairs democratically, that seems to be, that's, you know, the people controlling their own affairs instead of some king or whatever, right? Or a dictator. And there aren't many kings anymore these days, but dictator. Well, there are kings, but they're not really in power kings. Yeah, so okay. When we think about this, we have to distinguish at least three things here. So one is the nature of self-determination, what it is. So this is what you were talking about, right? So here's how Altman and Wellman put it right in the first page of the book, right? So a state can have a moral right against the rest of the world to order its affairs as it sees fit. And this is sort of individual sovereignty, if you're an individual, autonomy maybe, but then not in the individual case, but in the collective case, right? And in this case, they're talking about states, but it could be just any group, right? Societies, nations, groups, whatever. And that's going to be irreducibly collective in the sense that it's something you do together. All right, so that's what it is. Then there's another thing about what are the conditions on which you can have it. Right? So if there's a right to self-determination, and this is it, the right you have to order your affairs as you see fit as a group, well, then they also talk it several times, and you should keep this separately. This is what it is. These are the conditions that they have, and they claim here a state, or a group in this case, would have a moral right to political self-determination if and only if, so necessary and sufficient, it adequately protects and respects human rights. Necessary and sufficient means just like these are all the cases, and these are the only cases. So any group that does this has a right, or any state that does this has a right to self-determination, and only those groups and states that do this have a right to self-determination. Right? So that's basically, it's the entire story. Whenever you see if and only if, that just means this is the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Right? Yeah, Shane.
In that aspect of respecting human rights, is that when like individualism, value individualism is like integrated with self-determination?
Yes. So the way Altman and Wellman try to defend a collective value without being accused of the colonialism stuff that I was charging Jeff with unfairly, is because they have the human rights component. Right? They say no, it can be a sacrifice because only if they adequately protect human rights, so only if there is no sacrificing going on, will there be a right to self-determination. Right? So it means any state that starts abusing human rights loses the right to self-determination. You can see how this will lead to some things that are controversial later on this term, right? Look what the right is. It's a moral right against the rest of the world to order its affairs as it sees fit. So that'll mean like other states cannot start interfering and deposing governments and things like that. Right? Okay, well now if they don't adequately respect human rights, and guess what, lots of countries don't, then it does not have that right. So Altman and Wellman are committed to the view, just by these two things here, that lots of countries around the world don't have a right against the governments being overthrown from outside and so on. That's a controversial thing to say, right? If anything is. Jeff, I'll come back to you.
Sorry. Who really defines human rights? And do they come from a certain part of the world, like the Western world writes the script for that? You know, or they have some sort of input back in the day from the Warsaw Pact? You know what I mean? Like who?
I'm going to hide now.
So I don't know if
that's a huge question.
There's an assumption in that question, and that is that people are what assign human rights.
So, I mean, there's a thing here. Altman and Wellman, like I said before, right? So there's a number of heroic assumptions here, right? Like things are right and wrong to begin with, right? right? That's an assumption. We should be liberals. That's an assumption, right? To be a liberal means to be someone who holds that strong value individualism. That's an assumption. And then there's the assumption about human rights. Now, which human rights? How do we know about these human rights? So like, they're just assuming, like, okay, there's going to be something. For all these questions, there is going. Like, what we're doing is we're making assumptions, right? We're saying, like, okay, there's going to be a truth about the nature of ethics, right and wrong. Do I know what it is? No, right? I have some ideas, but they're not fully worked out, and they're definitely not sure to be correct. But I can make a theory where I say, well, whatever is correct about that, here's how it'll fit in my theory. So then my theory can go, and you can plug in the right theory of right and wrong. And you can say, okay, well, liberalism, here's my theory, it's this value individualism, okay. Well, if it's slightly different, then whatever the truth is, you can plug in the different idea, and then the theory should still work. And so that's how this human rights stuff is working for them too. They say, well, there's going to be some type of good answer to the question of what are human rights, where do they come from, and so on. And if human rights are real and they're really important, then once we figure out in some other term, in some other class, right, some other lifetime maybe, what really the truth about human rights is, then that's what fits in here. So respect those things, the actual true human rights, and we have to figure out what that is, of course, if we want to know all the answers. But I'm not going to get all the answers, right? But yeah, that's how they're trying to deal with it. Now, that's a big deal, right? The question you're raising is a question philosophers are debating, lawyers are debating, people who are involved in the human rights community are debating, and it's not settled at all. There are lists of human rights, but then there are lists and there are lists, right? There are some lists that are also very uncontroversial, the Universal Declaration from 1948, very uncontroversial, but then in addition to that list, lots and lots of more human rights have been proposed and still are being proposed and debated, and so on. Some people think that it's just Western views masquerading as human rights. Especially in the 80s, that was a big deal. There was a so-called Asian values movement that was mostly pushed out by the government of Singapore. But whatever, right? There was a thought there to say, well, these are Asian values that don't find reflection in the human rights doctrine, and so it's an imposition. And maybe that is true.
So they look for human rights that apply to all people in all cultures.
Right. And that matters, right? Because it's going to be an international standard. So this is going to be a standard by which one country can hold another country.
Right.
Including to whether they have a right that you don't come in and start messing around, right?
Right.
So that better be a standard that goes across different societies, cultures, countries. Sorry,
no, it's okay. At least in this book, they mentioned that they're dealing with like their threshold of decency, like their idea of rights is certain articles within the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So at least if this were to put into practice from their theory itself and nothing else, I think the rights that we're dealing with are those
right.
rights.
Yeah, and so they think, so the reason they, so what, your name?
Laurel.
Laurel? Yeah, the reason they do that, of course, is the same as what I said earlier, right? They try to make their assumptions as minimal and as uncontroversial as possible. So there's a number of human rights, specifically the ones they focus on, that are very uncontroversial, right? That almost nobody denies, and the only people really who deny it tend to be people who have a stake in denying it, namely the people who are violating those rights. So these are the things like rights against torture, arbitrary imprisonment and arrest, freedom of association, religion, and so on, right? These type of things. So the basic fundamental human rights. Now, but lots of people think that those rights are not enough, right? And that there are other human rights that are equally important, and we should add to them. And so that's the debate that I was talking about. But you're right; they're trying to say it's just that. But that itself is not an obvious thing. But I don't think so. There, lots of people think now have proposed that there's it's one of the more controversial. Ooh, bless you. One of the more controversial human rights that has been proposed is a human right to paid holiday. So if you don't have a paid days off for you, that's by some people's account a human rights violation. And Alman and Wellman aren't saying that if there's a country in which people don't have a human right don't have paid holidays, you can come in and set that right? So that's not what they have in mind.
Yeah.
Right.
I have a question.
Yeah, sure.
If you don't mind,
So I'm not sure. I mean, there are a number of good. Right, we'll back up. The original idea behind the human. Did you want to comment on this?
Well, yeah, I mean, in the United Nations, there's the human rights committee, and like the United Nations, just as a general, they do talk about human rights. And I mean, me being from Germany, we obviously have some different ideas of human rights. Well, not like the fundamental ones, but we do have some different ideas about human rights in Germany than we have in the U.S. And I think the easier way to look at it is that there are some human rights that when those are, if somebody doesn't like comply to them, then you will obviously say, okay, like, not going from, okay, what are the human rights you have to comply, like going that way, like, okay, you have to do this, 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 but like, if you do see, okay, there's a group, say ISIS, for example, they want to be a state, but you see, obviously, okay, they mistreat human rights, so like, you just see it automatically, you're not going, okay, so first, what would human rights be, what do they have to do, it's just obvious to the whole world community that is just wrong, that they are against human rights, and you can't say these are general human rights in the whole world. I think that's just impossible. But you can't say, okay, these are the fundamental ones that every country basically agrees to.
Like when the Nazis were
Was your question...
Sorry, he had his hand up.
So is it easier to point out what isn't human right versus what is? Like, rather when it's being violated.
But yeah, exactly, that's what I meant. Like, when,
violation.
like, it's easier to point out, okay, if there is a violation of something, than saying, okay, this is a human right, and now we can see, like, does everybody do this, you know?
Like a big holiday.
I don't like it. Once it is violated, it has to be its own. So it's hard to, at least for the initial violation, you can't stop it.
Right.
Were you asking that kind of epistemological question of like, how do we know what are these human rights, or were you asking what does it mean to be a human right? What is the nature of a human right? First one, okay.
Reggie?
My question was, I understand what she was just saying, but okay, like if you have the United States, say Germany, and then like you have ISIS or ISIL trying to create a state, so you have to be a legitimate state there in order to create, justify or acknowledge human rights being violated for somebody else. So my question would be, how does the United States, Germany, Britain, say Japan, or anybody else say what is morally wrong? Is it we're going by our cultural standards, or what we go by to justify another country, or how would that work?
Yeah, so the original idea behind human rights as a project, right? Like the human rights is a fairly recent idea. Like it started more or less in the 20th century. There are intellectual roots that go further back, but the term human rights doesn't really exist until the 20th century. And really the second half of the 20th century. The original idea was to overcome all these type of worries. And just focus on like a group of rights that are so important and fundamental and uncontroversial that we actually, when we see the violations, we know immediately like this is something that's wrong. And then the project was to try and spell them out before they started getting violated, and just have a list and then say to everybody in the world, I think it's the one international document that was universally signed up to, like every country in the world actually accepted this. So to have something of a document and a standard by which you can then say, we know there are disagreements and we know there are different cultures and we're not trying to impose our views on it, but this is the part that no one can escape. And we'll see this later, by the way, like this, the aftermath of the Second World War, this mattered because one of the defenses that the Nazis used to give was when they were in the Nuremberg trials. And the Nuremberg trials were criminal trials, the first time in history that people were, like, crimes that were committed in war were treated as crimes. Like what you say. Normally you lose a war, you get executed just because you lost the war, or you get set free and you go home. Right? Those are the two options. What wasn't an option was you stand trial like an ordinary thief or a criminal, and then maybe you have to do jail time or something. Right? That never happened. But it happened in Nuremberg, and they said, well, you can't actually do this because we didn't break any laws. Because guess what? We wrote the laws, right? And the law said we get to do this. And so then the idea was, well, actually, there's a higher standard, a standard that applies that you can't change by just changing the laws of your country. And that standard is sort of what the human rights document is supposed to get at. And the basic idea, the first idea was to get, so to come back to your question about where do they come from, or what really is the foundation of them. Since then, lots of people have tried to give foundations, some good, some more problematic. But the first idea was to give no foundations. So the idea was these are kind of things that that people from a whole variety of different foundations can all agree upon. Religious, non-religious, different types of religion. We all agree that torture and arbitrary imprisonment and stuff. So people from Asia can accept this, people from Africa can accept this, people from Europe, from Latin America, so everyone from a different point of view can. It's like a sort of like a point of overlap, right? It's where all the views actually have some common core of content that they see. Well, that's really as well. And then that's all you need, right? So that was originally how they tried. Now, since then, of course, when the list starts expanding, you lose that idea, and so now you need foundations, and that's where a lot of the debate comes from. But anyway, the original idea was let's have some type of standard that is more than just one culture, and we can apply universally, and we can all agree from these different cultures on this is something that's untouchable. Right? That's why I was hiding underneath my desk a moment. Anyway. So, just for the purpose of reading the book, when you see Altman and Wellman talk about human rights, just think of the basic human rights that Laurel was talking about, right? So the more fundamental ones. So, I forgot to ask you your name. Claudia? Right. Yeah, Claudia was mentioning. So, it's the kind of stuff that ISIS is in the business of violating. Right? As a working hypothesis, that's a good one to go by. All right. Here's the third thing that we need to keep set. So what is it? When do you have it? And then implications. What does it mean to have it? Right? Like what follows if you do have that? So you have a right to order your affairs as you see fit. Okay. Well, what does that mean? Right? Okay. Well, it's going to mean a whole variety of things. Altman and Wellman think. It doesn't mean you have to be a democracy, although almost everybody else thinks so. There's a minority in that. Altman and Wellman think it does mean you have a right to separate from a larger country if you're a group that can govern itself. So you get a right to secession. They think it actually means that a country gets to exclude immigrants if it wants to. They're a controversial idea as well. It means you have a right of sovereignty against foreign invasion if you have a right to sovereignty. So there's a variety of implications are going to come from that. So we'll see this coming about as we move through term. All right, so far so good? All right. So here are a couple of things that have to do with self-determination. I'm going to go a little quicker, but something like that. So what are we talking about, right? When we talk about rights to democracy or secession, like separating yourself, or sovereignty and so on. So it's something that states, countries, groups can do. That's the collective part, right? Together, collectively. And it's something that apparently calls for respect. They talk about different forms of respect, if you remember from the reading, recognition, respect. Anyway, it doesn't really matter for us that much. Analogous to self-determination in the individual case or autonomy. Right? And then something that expresses the importance of groups and group membership, because it's going to be ultimately irreducibly collective. Right? So, roughly, these are some hallmarks of what they're talking about. So here's a first estimation. This is just my first stab at it after reading these pages. Right? So self-determination is a process, something that you do, right, as a group, by which states, groups arrange their affairs as they see fit, but within the constraints of human rights. This is a rough first stab at what self-determination might mean. So when we're talking about a right to self-determination, we're going to talk about a right to do that, right? The right to order your affairs as a group or as a state within the constraints of human rights. It's just hopefully clarifying what's going on in some of these pages. All right? All right. Last thing for today. Can you think of any alternatives to their theory? Well, there's at least a couple of questions that we can ask about it, right? So here's one question. So what exactly is the value of self-determination? Does anyone have an idea what that... So we still haven't quite solved the third question, right? Value individualism. So if there is value, it better have to do with individual people. But then there is, it's something we do together, and it has to do with groups and states and societies and so on. So what's so important about it? Any ideas?
About
Shay?
nation.
Yeah.
Those, for the most part, has to be done in groups, collectively, and it focuses on communities and not just individuals.
I hear you. It has to be done as a group that focus on communities. Okay, so why should I care? Right?
Here, because let's see, if one group is gone, like if one group is, I guess, taken away from a society, that society will be affected adversely.
Yeah, but that won't do, right? Can't say the society is affected because we're value individualists, remember? The society doesn't matter. Sydney, sorry? Yeah.
This allows you to be you and you to be you without it interfering with each other's lives, either harming you or making it to where your values are affected because of someone else's values.
Good. So how does it do that? So I mean, the idea is it's a right that states have to arrange their affairs as they see fit, right? So to be sort of independent and so on. How is that helping me to be me and you to be you?
It's so let's say KKK, they have the right to go have rallies, group meetings, express their own viewpoints. And even though other people don't like it, they don't like it's allowed, because this isn't harming you, and until the day it does harm you, that can still exist. So your individual views are allowed to be practiced because it's not harming or affecting someone else's. So you're allowed to be you without having to justify it or having to bend over because someone else doesn't like it.
Great, good, yeah. Reggie.
I would say because, as she was saying, with that example, and also because the self-determination, isn't it everybody as a collective? As long as you got the KKK and then you have, say, Black Panther, you got two groups, but everybody falls under the collective, everybody is safe under the collective moral rights that has to be adhered to within this group or the state, what I can call it.
Anthony?
Is this asking what is the value of self-determination? Like, what's the value of having a state?
Well, so, I mean, Elmer and Wellman say that states that protect human rights have a right to order their affairs as they see fit, right? So what's so important about that?
The ability to protect yourself from foreign invaders.
So, think about it this way, right? So, I mean, I think Sydney was onto something, so I'll get back to what she was saying in a moment. But think about it this way. So Canada can invade the U.S., right? It's supposed to, I mean, of course there's bad things that can happen from this, right? Like people get killed and so on. So I understand that's bad. They're killing people, right? But let's say Canada just announces, say, like this whole Trump-Clinton thing is a debacle, can't have that. We're just going to run the show. And it works. Imagine for a moment it works. That's a violation of self-determination, right? Because the Americans aren't ordering their affairs as they see fit anymore. The Canadians are running the show. Right? So if Altman and Wellman are right, something bad has happened just now. And it's not killing people, because we're just assuming like that it somehow works, magical story, whatever. But it's not the killing, because I understand why the killing is bad, but I don't need a theory of self-determination to explain that. Because I have a good theory about killing and pain and so on, right? So I already had that settled. Now the self-determination theory is supposed to be something extra. So what's the extra part? What's so bad about this, right? What did I lose?
It's kind of like you lost the United States. They already had the right. They already had the ability to sustain themselves. Just because another country can sustain themselves better doesn't mean that it gives them the right to take over and to annex another country.
Yeah, that's the idea. But now the question is why, right? Why would Mike?
Kind of sounds like it allows for the rise of nations, the nationality take form, so that everyone can grow on like equal playing field because we're all held to the same standard for fundamental same standards.
Right. Yeah, so I think something like what Sydney was saying, I think is going to be the answer, which is hopefully not in the form of the KKK, but in some form, right? it matters for individuals that we live in groups, or the groups that we're members of, or something. Like, people seem to care about this, right? KKK members, but also other people, and including, apparently, if Altman and Wellman are right, the countries that we live in. People think of themselves as Americans or as Canadians, and they care about that. And that doesn't seem to be just some sort of silly mistake or some fairy tale or something. There's something there, and so that's the kind of story that you have to tell, right? So there's value to self-determination in individualist terms if it matters to individuals that they are members of a certain state. Right? And that makes sense for them to care about that. Right? So, of course, we know they actually do, right? Because that's what these secessionist movements, that's what the Scots are trying to, that's what the Quebecois are trying to do, it's what the Kurds have been trying to do for, we know they want, we know people do care about that. But as long as that's not a real mistake, that's going to be the kind of story you have to tell, right? Because it's going to have to go back to individuals ultimately. So it's this type of group membership where the action would have to be. All right, I'm going to quickly run through this and then we'll go. So, blah, 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 blah. Here's a further question, whether self-determination really must be collective. If we're telling this kind of story that I just did, where it's group membership for the individuals that matters, can't we just give a thoroughly individualistic story? Like, aren't we just reducing it now to individualist? It's a good philosophical question to try and chew on, right? All right, and here's this thing we talked about before. Well, if you start rejecting this form of value individualism because you care about animal rights or because you care about whatever, right? Well, then we're opening up the story maybe for a different theory of self-determination, right? One that doesn't have to go all the way back to individuals, but one that can start talking about the community having value, sort of the way that you suggested earlier. And we'll see that next time when we talk about Walzer. All right, I got a couple of minutes. Does anyone have any questions, burning issues you want to discuss? All right, well, if something comes to mind, let me know. We got through it. You're still alive. I'll see you next week.